They thought your emotional openness meant you were naive, that because you spoke honestly, trusted deeply, and gave the benefit of the doubt, you must not be very sharp. And this is one of the most common and most costly misjudgments an avoidant makes. Let's get something straight. Emotional openness is not the absence of intelligence. It is not blindness. It is not a lack of discernment. In fact, it often signals the opposite. People who are emotionally aware tend to see patterns faster, read tone more accurately, and sense shifts in energy long before words ever change. But they also understand something avoidants don't. Reacting too early gives power away. So when you didn't call them out immediately, when you didn't interrogate every inconsistency, when you didn't explode at the first sign of distance, they assumed you hadn't noticed. They told themselves a comforting story. They're too trusting, too innocent, too emotionally invested to see what's really happening. And that story allowed them to keep going. What they failed to understand is that awareness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes awareness is quiet. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it waits. Avoidants are used to operating in environments where emotional confusion gives them leverage. They've learned, often early in life, that staying vague keeps them safe. If they pull back just enough, if they send mixed signals, if they create a little emotional fog, most people panic. Most people overextend, chase clarity, or abandon their own needs just to restore connection. And over time, avoidants start to believe this pattern means control. So when you didn't play your part, when you stayed grounded instead of reactive, it didn't register as strength. It registered as simplicity. They mistook your self-regulation for ignorance. But here's the truth. People who are emotionally regulated aren't slow. They're selective. They don't rush to confront because they're not trying to win an argument. They're trying to understand reality. They notice the delayed replies, the sudden coldness, the inconsistency between words and actions. They log it mentally. They connect the dots. And instead of asking, how do I fix this? They ask a far more dangerous question. Is this aligned with what I deserve? That question alone destabilizes the entire avoidant strategy, because avoidant behavior depends on the assumption that the other person is unaware of the game, or at least too emotionally dependent to step out of it. When you remain open but not desperate, warm but not chasing, engaged but not self-abandoning, it creates a contradiction they don't know how to process. In their mind, openness and strength cannot coexist. But in reality, that combination is exactly what makes someone impossible to manipulate. Your openness wasn't a lack of boundaries. It was a choice. You chose to lead with sincerity while you gathered information. You chose not to weaponize your awareness. You chose maturity over impulse. And because avoidants are often oriented around emotional defense rather than emotional truth, they misread that choice entirely. This is where philosophy meets psychology. There's an old idea that the strongest person in the room is not the loudest, but the most self-contained, the one who can feel deeply without being controlled by those feelings. That's what they didn't account for in you. They assumed that because you cared, you were controllable, because you empathized, you were exploitable, because you didn't react, you didn't see. But what they were actually witnessing was someone with internal authority, someone who didn't need to prove awareness through confrontation, someone who understood that clarity reveals itself over time and that patterns don't lie, but people often do. And eventually this miscalculation catches up to them, because the moment you stop offering unlimited access to your emotional energy, the illusion collapses. Suddenly they're confused. Suddenly they feel exposed. Suddenly they're the one wondering when the shift happened. It happened the moment they underestimated you. They thought your openness was naivete. In reality, it was confidence. And the difference between the two is this. Naivete is unaware of danger, but confidence sees it and stays calm anyway. After they decided you were too naive, the next phase began. This is where avoidants start testing boundaries, not consciously in a villainous way, but instinctively. It's a survival strategy they've refined over time. They push, pull, withdraw, reappear, delay, go cold, then warm again, all to answer one quiet question: how much can I do without losing you? Boundary testing isn't random, it's data collection. Every delayed reply, every sudden emotional distance, every moment of inconsistency is an experiment. If you chase, they learn they can retreat further. If you over-explain, they learn they don't have to clarify. If you tolerate confusion, they learn they don't need to be consistent. And gradually, a silent contract forms, one where your nervous system does the work and theirs stays protected. What's important to understand is that avoidants don't test boundaries to dominate. They test boundaries to feel safe. Control, for them, is not about power over you, it's about relief from vulnerability. When closeness starts to trigger old fears of engulfment, of dependency, of being seen, they look for space. But instead of asking for it directly, they create conditions that force you to adapt. This is where most people lose themselves, because the tests are subtle. They're plausible. They come with just enough affection to keep hope alive. And if you don't know what you're looking at, you start negotiating with your own standards. You tell yourself you're being patient, understanding, flexible. But slowly, flexibility turns into self-erasure. Avoidants assume this process will work on you too. They assume that if they withdraw affection, you'll increase effort. If they become vague, you'll seek clarity. If they go silent, you'll fill the silence with reassurance. And at first, maybe you did because you're human, because you care, because connection matters to you. But then something shifted. Instead of escalating your energy, you paused. Instead of chasing consistency, you observed inconsistency. Instead of explaining yourself, you let the absence of effort speak for itself. And this is the moment the test fails. When you stop participating in the experiment, the data collapses. There's nothing for them to measure anymore. They don't get confirmation that pulling away increases your investment. They don't get proof that ambiguity keeps you attached. What they get instead is uncertainty, their uncertainty. And that's deeply uncomfortable for someone who relies on predictability to manage emotional risk. This is where psychology turns inward. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to changes in relational dynamics, even if they can't articulate them. They sense when the usual levers stop working, when your tone changes, when your availability shifts, when your emotional energy no longer spikes in response to their distance. And that's when anxiety creeps in. Not because they're suddenly in love, but because they've lost a familiar structure. They expected you to bend. Instead, you stabilize, and stabilization is threatening to someone who avoids intimacy. Because stability exposes patterns, it removes drama, it removes urgency, it creates space for reflection. And reflection is where avoidants encounter something they've spent a lifetime dodging, their own role and dynamic. Philosophically, boundaries are not walls, they're definitions. They clarify where you end and another person begins. When you stop adjusting yourself to accommodate emotional unpredictability, you're not punishing the other person, you're telling the truth. You're saying, this is where I stand, and truth has a way of disrupting games that depend on confusion. They may not confront you directly. In fact, they rarely do. Instead, you'll notice subtle changes. Curiosity replaces indifference. Warmth returns in small doses. The pull becomes less aggressive. Because on some level, they recognize they've reached the edge of their influence. And here's the part they never anticipate. You didn't win by outplaying them. You won by opting out. You refused to earn connection through self-betrayal. You refused to prove your worth through endurance. You stopped teaching them how to treat you by what you tolerated. That's when the power dynamic reverses. Not because you asserted control, but because you reclaimed authorship over your own emotional life. And once you stop teaching someone that your boundaries are negotiable, every test they try after that only proves one thing. They were never testing your weakness. They were revealing their own. When the boundary test stopped working, something even more unsettling happened for them. You became quiet. Not emotionally cold, not bitter, not dramatic, just still. And for an avoidant, that silence is louder than any confrontation could ever be. Avoidants are comfortable managing reactions. They know how to handle anger, pleading, emotional explanations, even tears. Those responses confirm engagement, they create movement, they offer something to respond to, adjust against, or retreat from. What they don't know how to manage is composure without access, calm without reassurance, presence without pursuit. Your silence wasn't absence, it was containment. At first, they interpreted it the same way they interpreted your openness, as a misunderstanding. They assumed you were processing, that you'd come back with questions or clarity seeking or a demand for reassurance. They waited for the familiar emotional signal that would allow the dynamic to continue, but it didn't arrive. And this is where the psychology gets interesting. Silence removes narrative control. When you stop explaining yourself, the avoidant loses the ability to shape the story. There's no emotional feedback to reinterpret, no words to distort, no react. Ion to frame as too much or unreasonable. What's left is behavior. And behavior, unlike words, doesn't argue. Your silence forced the spotlight onto their actions. The distance, the inconsistency, the lack of follow-through, without your emotional labor filling the gaps, those patterns stood naked in the space between you. And avoidants are deeply uncomfortable when patterns become visible, because visibility threatens the defenses they rely on to stay emotionally detached. Philosophically, silence is a form of truth-telling. It's what happens when you stop negotiating reality. You weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because everything that mattered had already been demonstrated, and in doing so, you refused to participate in the emotional theater that keeps avoidant dynamics alive. What they felt next wasn't clarity, it was destabilization. Avoidants regulate closeness through distance, but when distance no longer produces pursuit, it loses its function. The lever breaks, the mechanism fails, and suddenly the strategy that once kept them safe starts working against them. They begin to feel exposed, not because you attacked them, but because you didn't. There's a paradox here that most people miss. Avoidants often fear confrontation less than they fear reflection. A confrontation allows deflection. Reflection requires ownership. Your silence didn't accuse them, but it didn't protect them either without your reactions. They had to sit with unanswered questions. Why didn't you push? Why didn't you fight for clarity? Why didn't you chase reassurance? And underneath those questions is the one they avoid at all costs. What if I'm the problem here? That's why silence feels so threatening. It removes the illusion that the tension is mutual or situational. It suggests that the dynamic itself may be unsustainable. And that suggestion alone can trigger deep internal conflict for someone whose identity is built around emotional independence and control. Your silence also marked a philosophical shift. You stopped outsourcing your sense of stability to the relationship. You didn't need constant engagement to feel grounded. You didn't need answers to know your worth. And that self-containment changes everything. It's the difference between seeking peace and embodying it. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it's alignment. Avoidants often mistake silence for disinterest. But what unsettles them is the quality of it. It's not resentful. It's not performative. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It simply exists. And that kind of silence suggests autonomy, a state where you are no longer emotionally dependent on their responses to regulate yourself. That autonomy breaks the spell because now they're the ones reaching for signals. They're the ones scanning for meaning. They're the ones wondering what changed. And the irony is sharp. The moment you stopped trying to be understood, you became impossible to ignore. This is why your silence wasn't passive. It was active self-respect. It was the decision to let reality speak louder than explanation. And once you do that, the entire dynamic is forced to evolve or end. So remember this. When you stop explaining what someone refuses to see, you don't lose your voice. You reclaim your power. At some point, usually much later than they expect, a realization begins to surface for them, and it's deeply unsettling. They start to understand that you didn't stay quiet because you were confused. You didn't remain composed because you were unaware. You weren't overlooking their behavior. You were seeing it clearly and choosing something else. This is where the avoidance internal narrative starts to fracture. Up until now, they've relied on a comforting belief that if you didn't object, you didn't notice. That if you stayed, you accepted. That if you didn't challenge their distance, you didn't understand it. But awareness doesn't always announce itself through confrontation. Sometimes awareness shows up as discernment, and discernment is far more dangerous to an avoidant than outrage. You see, confrontation keeps the relationship at the surface level. It allows debates about tone, timing, intentions. It keeps the focus on words. But discernment moves underneath all of that. It looks at consistency. It watches effort. It measures alignment between what's said and what's lived. And once someone is operating from discernment, they're no longer easy to mislead. This is why avoidants F10 feel blindsided when the dynamic finally shifts. They thought they were ahead of you emotionally. They believed they were managing the pace, the closeness, the terms. They didn't realize that while they were avoiding discomfort, you were gathering clarity. You weren't ignorant, you were patient. And patience, when paired with self-respect, becomes a form of quiet intelligence. It allows patterns to fully reveal themselves. It prevents premature conclusions. It keeps you from being pulled into emotional chaos. And when the pattern is finally clear, the decision becomes simple, not emotional, not dramatic, just inevitable. This is where philosophy enters the picture. There's a difference between knowing something intellectually and accepting it existentially. You may have sensed early on that something was off, but you didn't rush to label it. You let reality confirm it. That's not avoidance. That's wisdom. Avoidants, on the other hand, often live in the realm of plausible deniability. As long as nothing is explicitly named, nothing has to be owned. As long as you keep engaging, they can tell themselves the connection is intact. But when you shift from engagement to evaluation, the illusion collapses. Because evaluation doesn't argue. It concludes. What they realize, too late, is that your calm wasn't compliance. It was assessment. You were watching how they responded to emotional safety, how they handled accountability, how they treated consistency when it was no longer convenient. And once you saw the full picture, you didn't need to explain yourself. The data was sufficient. This is the moment when avoidants often experience a delayed emotional reaction, not because they suddenly understand love, but because they finally understand loss. They recognize that you didn't leave impulsively, you left consciously. And conscious exits are the hardest to reverse because they're not driven by emotion, they're driven by clarity. Your decision wasn't a punishment, it wasn't a strategy, it was a conclusion. And conclusions don't argue with the past, they step into the future. There's something profoundly unsettling about realizing that someone saw your limitations long before you did, that they noticed the gaps you avoided, that they gave you time, not because they were blind, but because they were fair. Avoidants often expect emotional reactions, not moral ones. They expect drama, not discernment. And when they're met with the latter, it forces an identity-level reckoning. This is why they replay the relationship in their mind later on, why they revisit moments, messages, silences. They're trying to locate the exact point where the power shifted. But the truth is, it didn't shift all at once. It shifted the moment you stopped confusing tolerance with trust. You didn't fail to see their behavior. You simply refused to make excuses for it. And that's the kind of clarity that doesn't announce itself loudly, but once it arrives, it cannot be undone. They finally sensed that they no longer had control over your emotional state. Something deep inside them reacted, and not in the way most people expect. It wasn't relief. It wasn't indifference. It was fear. Because for an avoidant, influence equals safety. And the moment that influence disappears, their internal alarm system switches on. Avoidants don't fear intimacy in the way it's often described. What they fear is emotional dependency that they cannot manage. Control for them has never been about dominance. It's been about predictability. If they can anticipate how close you'll get, how much you'll ask for, how strongly you'll react, they can regulate their own anxiety. When that predictability vanishes, so does their sense of safety. This is why your emotional independence unsettled them. You didn't announce it. You didn't weaponize it. You simply stopped orbiting their behavior. And when you stopped orienting yourself around their availability, the dynamic inverted. Suddenly, they were the ones trying to read you. What makes this moment particularly destabilizing is that it exposes a core contradiction in avoidant attachment. They want connection without vulnerability, autonomy without loneliness, influence without responsibility. As long as they believe they're slightly ahead emotionally, this illusion holds. But the moment they realize you are no longer waiting, adjusting, or hoping, the illusion fractures, they begin to feel something unfamiliar, irrelevant. In CE, not abandonment, irrelevance. And that cuts much deeper. Abandonment implies importance. Irrelevance suggests replaceability. When your emotional world no longer revolves around them, they're forced to confront the possibility that they are not the central regulating force they believe themselves to be. Psychologically, this triggers a fear response rooted in early experiences of inconsistent caregiving. Avoidance learned, often unconsciously, that closeness was risky and self-reliance was survival. But they also learned to manage others' emotional investment as a way to avoid being left. When you detach with dignity, you bypass both mechanisms. You're not chasing and you're not punishing. You're simply gone, and that's what they can't regulate. They may respond in subtle ways at first. Increased curiosity, small bids for attention, a softening of tone, not because they've suddenly become secure, but because they're trying to restore a familiar equilibrium. They want to feel the old leverage again, the reassurance that they still matter enough to move you. But here's where the shift becomes irreversible. You're no longer moved by proof. You don't need them to show up differently to validate your worth. You don't need closure to justify your peace. And without those hooks, their influence has nowhere to land. Philosophically, this is the transition from external validation to internal authority. When your sense of self is no longer negotiated through someone else's behavior, you become psychologically sovereign. And sovereignty is deeply threatening to anyone who relies on relational control to feel stable. Avoidants often confuse this loss of control with rejection, but it's more accurate to call it exposure. Their strategies stop working not because you change the rules, but because you stop playing the game. And games only function when both parties agree to the premise. This is why avoidants sometimes oscillate after this point. One moment they appear distant, the next moment emotionally available. They're not trying to manipulate you, they're trying to reestablish certainty. They want to know where they stand, but the irony is that by the time they ask that question, you've already answered it internally. You didn't take your power from them. You reclaimed it for yourself, and in doing so, you forced them to face something they've spent a lifetime avoiding, the truth that connection cannot be controlled without being diminished. Influence that depends on fear is not intimacy, it's containment. And once containment fails, what remains is choice. Your choice. You chose not to be regulated by someone else's avoidance. You chose self-trust over emotional negotiation. And in that choice, their deepest fear was realized. Not that they lost you, but that they never truly had you to begin with. And when someone realizes that control was the only thing keeping the connection alive, the loss they feel isn't romantic. It's existential. And this is where everything resolves. Not with drama, not with confrontation, not with a final emotional exchange, but with a quiet shift that changes the entire story. The real failure was never that their tactics stopped working. The real failure was that you outgrew the dynamic entirely. Growth is the one variable avoidants rarely account for. They expect reactions, patterns, cycles. They expect distance to be met with pursuit, silence with explanation, uncertainty with effort. What they don't anticipate is evolution. They don't anticipate the moment when someone stops trying to manage the relationship and starts managing themselves. At some point, you stopped asking, how do I make this work? And started asking, why am I working so hard to stay small here? That question alone marks the end of the old dynamic, because once self-respect enters the room, manipulation, intentional or not, loses oxygen. You didn't become colder, you became clearer. This clarity didn't arrive overnight. It was built slowly through observation, through disappointment, through moments where your intuition whispered truths you weren't ready to act on yet. But eventually, clarity stops being a feeling and becomes a decision. And once it does, there's no going back to emotional bargaining. Avoidants often rely on the other person's hope to keep the connection alive. Hope that things will improve. Hope that effort will be rewarded. Hope that love will eventually feel safe for both people. But hope, when it's one-sided, becomes a trap and you stepped out of it. What you chose instead was alignment. Alignment between your values and your behavior. Alignment between what you offered and what you accepted. Alignment between the love you were willing to give and the love you were willing to receive. And alignment is not dramatic, it's decisive. Psychologically, this is the moment you reclaim authorship over your emotional life. You stop outsourcing your sense of worth to someone else's capacity. You stop interpreting their limitations as a challenge you need to solve. You recognize a truth that's both liberating and sobering. Someone else's avoidance is not your responsibility. Philosophically, this is a return to self-trust. You honor what you feel without needing it to be validated. You respect your standards without needing to defend them. You walk away not because you were unloved, but because you were awake. This is why avoidants often experience a delayed reckoning after the connection ends. They replay conversations. They reinterpret silences. They wonder when the shift occurred. But what they're really confronting is the realization that they were never in control of your growth. They were only in control of the environment you eventually outgrew. Your power didn't come from winning an argument or exposing their behavior. It came from choosing yourself without resentment, from leaving without needing them to understand, from moving forward without carrying the need for vindication. That kind of exit is final, not because it's harsh, but because it's complete. You didn't disappear to punish them. You didn't detach to provoke regret. You stepped away because staying would have required betraying yourself. And that's a boundary no emotionally mature person crosses twice. This is the moment where the story stops being about them altogether. Their realization, their regret, their confusion, none of it defines what happened. What defines it is that you recognize your worth before the dynamic could convince you otherwise. And that's the ultimate transformation. When you no longer need someone to choose you because you've already chosen yourself. So if there's one thing to carry with you from this, let it be this. When why? Outgrow a dynamic built on avoidance, you don't lose love, you lose limitation. In the end, this story was never about an avoidance tricks, tests, or fears. It was about your awakening. They thought you were too naive to see what was happening. But what they misunderstood was the depth of your awareness. You saw the patterns. You felt the shifts. You recognized the distance for what it was. And instead of reacting from fear, you responded with growth. That choice changed everything. Each phase of the dynamic revealed a truth. Your openness was never weakness. It was confidence. Their boundary testing didn't expose your limits. It exposed theirs. Your silence wasn't confusion. It was clarity taking form. Your calm wasn't compliance. It was discernment. And when their control faded, it wasn't because you fought for power, but because you no longer needed it. The real failure wasn't theirs alone. It was the collapse of a dynamic that depended on you staying smaller than you were. The moment you stopped negotiating your worth, the illusion ended. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need closure. You didn't need them to understand. You needed alignment, and you chose it. This is what emotional maturity looks like. It's quiet. It's grounded. It doesn't announce itself with ultimatums or drama. It simply moves on when something no longer matches your values. And that's why it's so unsettling to those who rely on avoidance to feel safe. So if you ever wonder whether you missed something, remember this. You didn't fail to see their behavior. You saw it clearly, and you refused to let it define you. You didn't lose them. You outgrew the version of yourself that would have stayed, and that is not a loss. That is freedom.